The fall from orbit. The trench was a wound across the plane and it would not close. The earth was black and wet and shook with each fresh impact. Every breath tasted of metal and dust and an old sweetness. That meant the medical foam had broken again and was leaking in the dugout. Keth stood under a bent beam with his rifle across his chest and watched the horizon burn a dull, angry red. The enemy came like a weather front, not as lines of soldiers, but as a moving shade that ate light and swallowed sound. Their shells did not whistle. They arrived already inside you like a clench of the heart, and then the ground leapt, and another section of the wall peeled down. He had seen many suns over the plains of Athos 9, but this one wore smoke like a crown. Above the haze, the sky was a gray lid, and there were streaks across it that Keth could not name. At first he thought they were more enemy needles, those thin, bright darts that fell without sound and opened like flowers of heat. But these streaks grew fatter and burned harder like anger that refused to cool. The ground crews shouted over the wire, and someone yelled, "Take cover," and someone else kept laughing because there was nowhere left to go. The enemy surge rose and fell like a tide, chewing trenches and leaving only dark shapes that twitched and then lay still. The streak hit. The shock lifted the trench boards and dropped them again. Keth fell to his knees and rolled onto his back as mud rained down. He heard a new sound that was not shellfire. It was a heavy groan overlapped with high sharp notes like metal singing to itself. The thing that had punched a crater 10 strides ahead of his section was not a bomb, it was a pod. It was round and ugly with plates welded at mad angles and scorched black where the fall had licked it clean. There was a yellow symbol, cut by burns, and a number, and a word in a blocky script he had seen only on supply crates brought by the rare human freighters. The pod hissed and split. A ramp slammed down and a figure walked out into the rain of grit. It was tall, but not monstrous, wrapped in armor that looked used and reused with edges that told stories. Keth saw the face, behind the visor for a blink, and marked the human eyes cold in their balance and warm in their spark. The figure carried a long weapon in a small pack, but the weight that mattered was the way the human carried the moment. The enemy surge had paused, as if unsure what this new thing meant. The human did not pause. He stepped onto the rim of the crater like a speaker onto a low stage and turned once, taking in the line, the gaps, the angles of the broken wall and the ruined wire. "Who is in charge?" came a voice through a local loudhail in clear trade tongue. It was not a question that needed a name. It meant who can still move, who can still listen. Keth found his hand rise. He had not chosen to be a leader. The old sergeant had been taken by a splinter of glass, and the one after that had bled out while whispering the names of his bond siblings. The human trotted toward him and dropped to a crouch that made a small wall of his armor between Keth and the nearest shadow of the enemy. "I'm Sergeant Cole Ward," he said. His breath misted in the cold. "I fell alone. I carry one drone, a line of micro-mines, a beacon, and bad news. Your flank is gone. Your center is folding. Your comms are jammed. But you are not dead yet. So you will help me. Hold." The last words were not a demand. They were a simple path. Keth nodded. He pointed across the trench to where the wall slumped nearest the open field. The enemy liked that place. It let them pour without climbing. The human looked once and then spoke fast. He named distances in a crisp rhythm, and his hands drew lines where fire should cross. He asked for the number of magazines and for the shape of the enemy when they pushed, and whether they tested with small groups or came as one storm. Keth answered and felt the strange lift that comes when someone gives your fear a job. The human placed the small mines in a curve that did not look like a curve to anyone standing in the trench. He tossed his drone into the air, and it whispered, up like a patient insect, and painted the world on a small wrist screen. When the surge came again, it found a different field. The first ranks rolled into a hole Keth had never seen there before. The human had told them to dig just so. A step more, and the mines snapped like teeth. The rush flinched and split, and that was when Ward spoke the word now, and the trench spat a steady sheet of fire that met the enemy at the moment of doubt. The human did not shout or rage. He touched shoulders and moved helmets a finger width. He fired in 3-round rhythm, then paused and moved again. He watched the drone and called angles. Keth felt his own breath settle into the beat, The enemy tried to smear along the wire and found its barbs laced with thin threads that sang when touched. The drone could hear it. The human could hear it. He sent a pair to the left bend with a bag of shrapnel grenades, and they broke the smear, and came back with eyes wide, and a laugh that sounded like life. The enemy tried to push through the low spot where the trench had sunk, but the human had measured it with his eyes and set the mines like seeds. No one cheered. They simply lived more minutes, and the minutes began to matter again. A shell landed close and threw Keth into the wall. His ear rang and the world went soft at the edges. He saw the human stand on the ramp again facing the open ground, with his visor up like a dare. He fired and stepped and fired and stepped. The enemy pulled back not far, but far enough to breathe. Keith tasted the air and felt there was space in his chest. He looked at the human and saw a person, not a myth. A person who fell alone into a storm and chose to make a shape in the chaos. When the lull came, Ward leaned his helmet against the beam and closed his eyes for 3 slow breaths. He opened them and spoke. "We will not be rescued tonight," he said. "We will become the reason rescue is still worth sending." He lifted the beacon from his pack. It was small and plain. He planted it deep in the mud at the trench lip, and the light inside it pulsed a heartbeat that even Keth could feel through his boots. "This is our anchor," Ward said. "The enemy hates anchors. We will teach them to fear this one." Keth felt the line of the trench straighten as if the boards had remembered how to be a wall. The night crawled nearer and the sky above the smoke went from gray to iron. The enemy would come again. He knew it. The human knew it. But something had changed. A single drop. Pot had fallen from orbit and with it a will that did not bend. He tightened his grip on the rifle and spoke softly, so only the beam and the mud could hear. "We are not dead yet." And for the first time since the day broke, it sounded like truth. A soldier, with a plan. The night did not wait for permission, and it spilled across the trenches like water over broken stone. The enemy had vanished from immediate view, but their shadow remained in the smell of burnt soil and the echo of distant shells. Keith followed the human as he moved along the line, and every step seemed to reorder the chaos around them. The human had a pace that carried authority without demand, and his armor clinked softly over the mud as though it had been molded to the rhythm of war. He paused at each section of the line and spoke not to the rank but to the fear. He asked for the number of remaining rifles and how many rounds they carried, and whether the old grenades had been accounted for. Every answer he received folded into his mind, and then released a plan that was impossible yet simple, and every alien who listened felt the clarity like a tide pulling them from drowning. Cole Ward was his name, but he made it matter less than the purpose he carried. The human looked at the map of the battlefield in the dim glow of the broken trench lamps and traced arcs with a finger that did not shake. He asked for the heights of the nearest berms, the width of the gullies, and the slope of the mud where the shells sank. He moved to the far left and crouched behind a broken wall. He reached into his pack and pulled out small devices that whined faintly when activated. They were drones, but unlike any Keth had seen. They moved not to survey but to warn, and to guide and to strike. The human sent one over the trench, and it hovered like a small predator scanning the terrain. It sent data back, and Ward used it to plot where the fire should go, where the traps should be laid, and how the few survivors could become a single body of resistance. Keth listened and realized the human treated fear like a tool, not a burden. He spoke of angles and timing of breath between pushes. He explained that the enemy came not to fight, but to assume victory, and that assumption could be stolen if the defenders moved with purpose and precision. He assigned roles to the ones who still had the courage to lift a rifle, and those who were too wounded to move became anchors in the trench, giving orders and marking positions. The human's eyes scanned constantly, and his visor reflected lines of light from the drones as if he were seeing every corner of the battlefield before it even existed. The first light of the stars revealed the enemy scouts creeping toward the trench at the edge of vision. Ward did not shout, he did not panic. He called a number into the comm unit, and the drone buzzed down into the mud. It struck with a small charge that threw the scouts into the air and pinned the remaining few behind. A ridge. Keith felt his jaw unclench as the alien unit beside him began to murmur a word that meant hope in their tongue. Ward did not celebrate. He replaced the drone in his pack and moved to another section. The line was not much better than a broken chain, but he spoke in rhythms that made each broken link feel like it could hold. By midnight, the human had reorganized the trench into layers of defense. He told the aliens how to move silently, how to watch and wait, how to make the enemy see gaps that did not exist. The mines were moved into patterns that even Keth could not understand until the first attack came and the enemy stumbled into the invisible teeth that had been laid in mud and shadow. The first real clash was brief, but shocking. The enemy tried to push into the trench, but every step met a counterstrike and a trap set not by instinct but by design. The aliens began to move in unison, not because they had always known how, but because the human had taught them the shape of fear and the rhythm of courage. Ward moved through the mud with a rifle held low and a voice that named what was coming. He pointed to the highest mound and told a small unit to sweep it, whispered to Keth and others where to hold and when to strike. It was as if he could see the battlefield as a living puzzle, and each piece was alive only because he allowed it to move. His tactics were strange, but every alien who followed them felt the sensation of control returning to their limbs. The first victory was a small one. The enemy had been repelled from a forward trench, and yet it felt enormous because the line still held and the survivors still breathed. The human walked to the edge of the trench and crouched under a fallen beam. He held the small beacon up to check the horizon and his hands did not tremble. His eyes were steady, even when a shell landed near enough to throw mud across his visor. He spoke once, and the words struck through the fear in Keith like a hammer. They are coming again and we will be ready. The calm did not require belief, it required action, and every alien soldier around him could feel the pulse of the order settling into their own hearts. Hours passed with the enemy probing and retreating like wolves testing a new scent. The human adjusted lines and gave small nods and gestures that turned hesitation into motion. He spoke of fire control and angles of approach and how to use the mud and rain to confuse sensors. He showed the aliens how to measure distances by shadow and sound, how to move without announcing presence, and how to make the ground itself a weapon. He did not demand obedience. He earned it with skill and vision. Keth realized that this was what humans did in war. They did not fight only with strength. They fought with foresight, with patience, and with a strange kind of madness that made the impossible practical. By the middle of the night, the alien soldiers were moving, like one living organism under the human's direction. They shifted and flowed through the trenches with a rhythm that had never existed before. Their hearts still pounded, but their fear became useful fuel for action. Every strike was measured, every pause intentional. Every step forward was a promise and every step back a lesson. Ward explained why the enemy assumed the humans were weak, why they underestimated the small number, and how assumptions could be exploited to fracture the advance. He never raised his voice. He never cursed or threatened. He simply showed what needed to be done, and the alien soldiers did it. Because he had made it clear that they could, Keth watched the human place. Another drone on a ridge that overlooked a shallow depression. The drone hovered silently and scanned, sending information to Ward's display. He marked positions and called names and directions with quiet precision. The next strike came and the alien line moved as though anticipating the enemy's intent. The first real hope in weeks spread like fire through the trench, and the soldiers whispered words of disbelief and awe. The human did not pause to acknowledge them. He walked along the line, instructing, adjusting, commanding by presence, not force. By the time the night reached its darkest hour, the alien trench line had been transformed from a place of despair into a calculated battlefield. The human had taken fear and turned it into a weapon. He had taken chaos and made it methodical. He had done what no alien commander had been able to do. And in his quiet way, he had proven that even a single human could change the outcome of the war. Keth felt something that had been lost in the mud and smoke return. He felt hope. He felt purpose. He saw the line of soldiers standing taller even if their armor was broken. He saw the small glowing beacon that pulsed like a heartbeat in the trench, and he realized that the human had given them more than strategy. He had given them belief. He had given them the sense that they were no longer waiting to die. They were waiting to fight and to win fire and grit. The first light of dawn broke over the battlefield, and it was a pale gray that did not promise warmth, but revealed the scars of night. The mud was churned and the broken armor of the aliens glistened with rain and sweat. The human moved like he belonged to this landscape, as if the trenches and broken walls had been built for his footsteps. He held his rifle with calm, and his eyes swept across the horizon, measuring every rise and fall in the terrain. Keth followed, and he could see how every move of the human commanded attention without shouting, without demanding respect. The soldiers listened to the orders as though each word carried the weight of certainty, and each gesture was a signal that the impossible could be achieved. The enemy had regrouped, and they moved in waves that tried to push the alien line into submission. But Ward had prepared every inch of the trench. He had placed tripwires in mud puddles and mines under the footing that the enemy would rely on. He had trained the aliens to read the shadows and anticipate movement, and now when the first wave came, they met not only fire but precision, traps that scattered and confused them. Their advance slowed, and Keth could hear the murmurs of surprise and fear ripple through the attackers. The human moved along the trench, and his presence alone was enough to steady trembling limbs. He adjusted positions and whispered corrections, and every alien soldier under his direction became part of a single machine with rhythm and purpose. The clash was sudden and violent. The enemy tried to push over a ridge, and Ward had positioned a small unit there that moved like ghosts. They struck with rifles and explosives and then retreated into cover before the enemy could counterstrike. The drones hovered silently above recording movements and sending information back, and Ward adjusted his line and called names and locations with a calm that contrasted with the chaos around him. Keth felt his heart pound, not from fear, but from adrenaline and awe. He saw how the human anticipated the enemy's moves before they happened, and how even in the mud and blood the soldiers moved with a newfound confidence. He realized that this was not just strategy. This was human ingenuity applied to desperation, and it transformed the battlefield. By mid-morning, the trench line had become a living fortress. The enemy tried to flank the left side, but Ward had already anticipated it, and the humans and aliens moved to intercept. They used mud as camouflage and the broken walls as shields, and the enemy stumbled into a funnel that led them into crossfire and traps. The air was filled with smoke and the sound of rifles and explosions, and yet through it all the human moved like a conductor, orchestrating the symphony of defense. Every command was clear and every adjustment calculated, and the alien soldiers began to see the battlefield not as chaos but as a series of opportunities that could be controlled. Keth saw a unit of young aliens hesitate under heavy fire, and Ward ran through the mud to reach them. He did not scold or berate. He simply pointed and demonstrated, and within moments the unit moved into position and struck back with precision. The hesitation was gone, replaced with focus and determination. The human's eyes scanned constantly, and he adjusted positions and timing like a master of rhythm. He placed small devices that hummed faintly, and the enemy found their path blocked in ways that made no sense until the human called it a trap, and the aliens understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, something designed to survive and to fight back. The noon sun climbed, and the enemy regrouped for another push. They tried to exploit the gaps that existed in the mud and broken trench walls. But Ward had prepared for this. He signaled a small detachment to move, and they struck from a hidden position, cutting the enemy advance in half, and the remaining attackers faltered. Keith realized that the human had not only taught them tactics, he had taught them courage and timing, and how to read fear in others and use it to their advantage. The drones hovered above and sent data that Ward used to predict the next strike, and he adjusted positions and timing again and again like a chess player who could see 20 moves ahead. By mid-afternoon, the battle had shifted. The enemy had lost momentum, and the aliens were beginning to press forward. They moved in coordinated strikes, with Ward calling positions and targets and timing, and every alien soldier felt a strange sense of unity, as though the battlefield itself had become a single body that responded to one mind. The first human casualty was a shock, but Ward did not hesitate. He redistributed forces and moved forward and inspired the soldiers with words and actions that made fear a tool, not a burden. Every inch of ground taken was a lesson, and every successful strike a proof that a single human could change the course of a hopeless battle. Keth saw the enemy falter and retreat, and he felt a surge of pride mixed with disbelief. The human had not just defended a trench. He had transformed despair into action and chaos into a controlled torrent of strategy and skill. He moved through the battlefield, placing devices, calling names, adjusting angles, timing strikes, and the aliens moved in response as though guided by a force beyond understanding. The human's presence was magnetic, and the alien soldiers could not help but follow every instruction with precision and focus. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, the trench line had become unrecognizable from the night before. The mud and broken walls were still there, but now they were symbols of resistance and preparation. The human walked through the line and touched shoulders and nodded and whispered encouragement, and every alien soldier felt the courage to hold the line and advance further. The enemy had retreated to regroup, and the aliens had learned a lesson that would not be forgotten. They had learned that one human with vision and skill could turn the tide of war, and that courage could spread like wildfire when guided by someone who refused to surrender. Keth stood in the trench and watched Ward as he adjusted a drone and surveyed the battlefield. He realized that the human had not just survived the drop pod, he had arrived with purpose and skill, and now he was teaching them how to fight and how to win. He felt hope and fear and admiration all at once, and he knew that the rest of the battle would be different because of the presence of this single human soldier and the fire and grit that he had brought to a line that had been on the brink of destruction. The counteroffensive. By the time the second night fell, the trench line had been rebuilt and reinforced not by walls alone but by strategy and the minds of soldiers who had once known only fear. Ward moved along the line, and every step he took seemed to charge the air with determination. The human had shown them how to fight defensively. But now it was time to take the initiative. Keth watched as Ward gathered the small unit of aliens who had survived the worst of the night and spoke in calm tones that commanded attention without raising his voice. He outlined the plan with precision and clarity, and even the most frightened soldiers felt confidence in his words and in his gestures. He did not talk of bravery, only of execution and timing. And the aliens understood that courage could be learned by doing, not by speaking. The drones hovered above, silently sending back real-time data, and Ward adjusted positions as if he were sculpting the battlefield. He sent small teams to probe the enemy lines, and each team moved with stealth and purpose, guided by instructions that Ward had refined from observations, and the aliens followed because his logic was undeniable, and his presence demanded trust. Every device placed, every rifle aimed, every step taken was calculated to weaken the enemy before the main force moved forward. Keth felt a strange excitement building in the trench as the soldiers realized that they were no longer simply waiting for attacks. They were preparing to strike. As the first light of dawn tinted the horizon, the counteroffensive began. Small teams moved out quietly, slipping through mud and broken terrain to strike at supply lines and communication nodes. The human led from the front, and his eyes scanned constantly for movement, and his mind seemed to calculate angles and timing faster than the bullets could fly. He placed devices that exploded not with chaos but with precise timing that disrupted the enemy formations. The alien soldiers moved in unison now, understanding his signals and instructions without hesitation or second-guessing, and Keth saw the enemy falter even before the main force engaged. The first wave of the main assault hit, and the human had prepared the terrain like a trap laid by a master. The enemy ran into fields of fire they had not anticipated, and the aliens moved through the chaos with coordination and precision. Keth could see how Ward used the environment as a weapon, how every mound of mud, every fallen beam, every crater became an obstacle for the attackers and an advantage for his small unit of soldiers. He moved along the front, calling out adjustments and timing every strike, and the alien soldiers responded instantly. The tide was turning not because of numbers but because of skill and ingenuity. By mid-morning the enemy was fragmented and confused. They tried to regroup, but every attempt was met with calculated resistance. Ward had positioned units to cut off escape routes and to create crossfires, and every alien soldier now moved as part of a single organism responding to the rhythm of his commands. The drones provided constant updates, and Ward used the information to predict enemy movements and deploy soldiers and devices exactly where they were needed. Keth could not believe how much ground they had taken, and how every action was precise, not chaotic, and how one human had transformed a line of broken soldiers into a force capable of offense. The counteroffensive pressed deeper into enemy territory, and Ward never paused. He moved through mud and rubble, adjusting lines and giving instructions, and his presence inspired the soldiers to move faster and strike harder. They captured supply depots and took enemy positions with minimal losses, and every captured position became a foothold for the next. Pushketh noticed that even the youngest and weakest soldiers were following his instructions with confidence and courage. They moved with a purpose that had been absent for weeks, and the sense of hopelessness had been replaced with determination and belief. By afternoon, the enemy lines were fractured and their command was in disarray. Ward anticipated their next move and set ambushes and traps, and the alien soldiers executed them perfectly. The battlefield became a landscape of careful planning, not of blind slaughter. Each push was methodical, each strike calculated, and every step forward was a lesson in precision and patience. Keth felt his respect for the human deepen, because Ward had not only survived his drop pod, but had turned survival into a strategy, and strategy into a movement that could change the outcome of a war. The alien soldiers who had once been terrified now moved like warriors, not because they had always known how, but because they had learned from the human who refused to accept defeat. He showed them how to read the battlefield like a map, how to use fear and expectation against the enemy, and how to turn every obstacle into an advantage. The counteroffensive was more than a battle. It was a demonstration of human creativity and adaptability, and Keth could feel it in every coordinated movement, every strike, every decision that shaped the fight. As the sun began to sink, the last enemy positions in the sector were being taken. Ward walked along the captured trenches and checked the lines and placed new devices and called out instructions for patrols and reserves. He did not celebrate yet because the battle was ongoing, but he had proven that one human could turn a defensive nightmare into an offensive triumph. The alien soldiers looked at him not as a commander but as a force of nature that had arrived from the sky to teach them how to win. Keth realized that the tide had truly turned, and the story of despair had been rewritten by strategy and grit and the will of a single human soldier. By nightfall, the counteroffensive had pushed the enemy back to their last stronghold, and the alien soldiers were exhausted, but not defeated. They had seen what one human could do, and they had become something more than survivors. They were warriors guided by vision and determination, and Keth felt a sense of pride that had been foreign to him before the arrival of the drop pod. Ward moved through the line, placing drones and checking positions, and his calm presence carried the weight of command without burden. He had turned a hopeless situation into a battlefield of opportunity, and the aliens knew that with him, they could achieve the impossible. The enemy strikes back. The night was restless, and the alien soldiers huddled in the trenches, their eyes flicking to shadows and every sound amplified in the silence. The counteroffensive had gone further than anyone dared hope, but Ward knew the enemy would not surrender so easily. He moved among the soldiers, checking positions, whispering instructions, and adjusting patrols. His presence was steady and commanding, and every alien soldier felt an energy in the air that told them they were not alone in this fight. The drones hovered above silently, scanning the horizon, and Ward studied the data, calculating every possibility, as the enemy prepared to retaliate. By the early hours, the first signs of the enemy attack appeared, distant rumblings and flashes of light on the horizon that hinted at a force gathering with the intent to crush the line. Ward called out positions and directed soldiers to fortified points. He moved through mud and broken barricades, adjusting angles and distances, and every soldier responded instantly to his commands. They had learned the rhythm of strategy, the timing of action, and the courage that could be taught through example. Keth watched as the human prepared the defenses not with fear, but with purpose, as though he could see the attack before it even began. The enemy struck suddenly with a wave that combined speed and aggression. They aimed for the center of the trench line, hoping to split the alien forces. But Ward had anticipated this. He moved forward, placing devices and repositioning units, and even the smallest alien soldier now moved with precision and timing. They blocked advances and counterattacked in ways that fractured the enemy momentum. Keth saw squads that had hesitated before now, charging forward with confidence, following the humans' every gesture and instruction. The battlefield was chaos controlled by order and instinct, and the humans stood at its center, orchestrating the flow of action. Explosions shook the ground, and mud sprayed through the air. But Ward did not falter. He adjusted lines, repositioned troops, and placed traps that slowed and disrupted the enemy. The aliens moved like shadows, striking quickly and retreating just as fast. Every move predicted and coordinated, as if guided by a mind that could see beyond the immediate threat. Keth realized that fear had become a tool now, not a burden. The soldiers no longer thought of survival alone. They moved to dominate too. Control, and to teach the enemy a lesson that would echo beyond this battle. By mid-morning, the enemy was pushing harder, trying to exploit gaps, but every attempt was met with calculated force. The human moved along the front, checking angles and calling out adjustments, placing mines and directing fire, and the alien soldiers executed flawlessly. They used the terrain as a weapon, and the enemy fell into traps and ambushes that had been prepared for this moment. Ward anticipated every tactic and countered with patience and precision, and the alien soldiers felt invincible under his guidance. Keth watched and felt awe and pride, and a recognition that this human had reshaped the battlefield with intellect and willpower. The clash intensified. As enemy reinforcements arrived, Keth saw units that had once inspired terror now falter, under the combined pressure of the human strategy and the alien soldiers' newfound skill. Ward moved through the battlefield, placing drones, adjusting lines, and whispering instructions that carried weight across the trenches. Every device, every signal, every order was precise, and Keth realized that the human had become more than a soldier. He had become a symbol of resistance and hope, the presence that reminded everyone that surrender was never an option. By afternoon, the enemy had regrouped for a final strike. They launched a concentrated assault aimed at the right flank, hoping to break through and collapse the line. Ward anticipated this, too. He moved units into hidden positions and placed explosives that would trigger at the exact moment. Keith saw soldiers moving in perfect synchronization, cutting off the attackers and forcing them into choke points. The human's mind seemed to calculate every possible outcome, and every soldier responded with instinctive precision. The battlefield was no longer a place of randomness. It was a controlled force driven by determination and skill, and the human was at the center, guiding every movement. The enemy's morale began to crumble as they met resistance at every turn. Their attacks faltered and their units became disorganized. Keth saw commanders giving impossible orders and soldiers hesitating, and Ward exploited every hesitation, placing forces exactly where they could have the greatest effect. He moved forward and rallied troops in person, showing them not by words but by action that defeat was never final and victory could be carved from the chaos of battle. The humans' presence alone seemed to amplify courage and clarity, and the alien soldiers pushed forward with renewed energy. By sunset, the battlefield was littered with signs of struggle and victory. Keth looked around and saw the enemy retreating for the first time under pressure that had once seemed unimaginable. Ward walked through the trenches, placing drones, checking positions, and nodding quietly as he observed the results of strategy applied to desperation. The alien soldiers cheered in muted relief and pride, because they had learned to fight not as individuals but as a single unit guided by vision and intelligence. The enemy had struck back with everything they had, but the human had turned their assault into a lesson in coordination and courage. Keth realized that the enemy would regroup again, but now they had seen what they were up against. They had faced a line led by a human who refused to yield, who had taught courage and precision to a species that had once thought themselves defenseless. The counterattack had been a trial by fire, and the human had proven that strategy and willpower could surpass numbers and fear. Keth felt a deep respect and an unshakable belief that with this human leading them, they could survive anything and perhaps even win the war. By nightfall, the line held, and Ward moved along, placing sensors and preparing for the next engagement. The alien soldiers rested briefly, but they knew that the human had changed everything. They would no longer wait for attacks, they would anticipate. They would strike, they would win, and the presence of one human soldier had transformed hopelessness into opportunity, into fire, into grit, into a force that refused to surrender. The final push. The dawn broke, with a silver haze over the battlefield, and the alien soldiers moved silently through the trenches. Their eyes alert, their weapons ready, but their minds focused on a single point. The human who had changed everything. Ward had spent the night reviewing drones and maps and positioning troops, and now he walked among the soldiers, checking lines and whispering adjustments that carried authority without arrogance. Every soldier who looked at him felt a surge of confidence because he had proven that one human could defy fate and turn despair into a strategy and hope into action. Keth followed him, watching every motion and realizing that the final push would not just be a battle. It would be a lesson in what courage and intelligence could achieve. Enemy had gathered in their last stronghold, a massive structure surrounded by walls and turrets and defenses that had once seemed impenetrable. But Ward did not hesitate. He moved through the trenches, calling out positions, sending squads to key points, and placing explosive devices that would disrupt and confuse the enemy. Every alien soldier knew their role without needing repeated orders, because they had learned from observation and action, and the human led them not by fear, but by example and planning. The battlefield seemed alive with movement and coordination, as if guided by a single mind calculating every step. By mid-morning, the first wave advanced, and Ward had prepared the terrain like a chessboard. Every mound, every ditch, every barrier was a trap waiting for the enemy, and every squad moved with precision, striking at exactly the right moment. Keth could see that the alien soldiers were no longer hesitant or afraid. They attacked with discipline and courage, and even the weakest soldier moved with purpose because they had learned from the human how to turn fear into action, how to anticipate, how to strike and retreat, how to win where before they would have fled. The enemy responded with force. They poured fire and drones and reinforcements into the assault, hoping to crush the line. But Ward had anticipated every tactic. He moved squads into flanking positions, placed explosive traps along the anticipated routes, and guided the soldiers with signals and whispers and gestures that were understood instantly. Keth watched as squads intercepted attackers before they could reach the trenches, and as drones and devices disrupted formations, creating chaos for the enemy, an opportunity for the defenders. The battlefield became a symphony of strategy. Every move harmonized with purpose and every strike calculated to bring maximum effect. By noon, the enemy was fragmented and forced to fall back in small groups, but Ward pressed the attack. He moved through mud and smoke, adjusting squads, checking lines, and encouraging soldiers who were exhausted but determined. The alien soldiers had learned to trust instinct guided by intelligence, and they followed every order with precision and energy. The human led not just by action but by presence, inspiring a courage that spread like fire across the battlefield. And Keth realized that hope had been transformed into unstoppable force. The central command of the enemy was under siege, and Ward had anticipated their countermeasures. He positioned drones to track movements, deployed small teams to intercept communications, and sent squads to cut off reinforcements. The alien soldiers moved like shadows, appearing suddenly, striking decisively and retreating before the enemy could respond. Keth saw the lines collapse under pressure and the morale of the enemy crumble as they realized they were facing not just soldiers, but a mind that had anticipated their every move and turned the battlefield into a weapon. By afternoon, the final breach was within reach. Ward led the assault personally, guiding squads through the ruined defenses and placing charges and explosives at critical points. Keth followed him into the chaos, seeing alien soldiers move with speed and precision, firing and advancing without hesitation. The human's presence carried weight beyond words. He was a signal of action, a reminder that no obstacle was too great and no enemy too strong. The final push became a storm of coordination and courage, every step forward pushing the enemy closer to defeat, and every strike exacting the price of their miscalculation. The enemy tried to mount a desperate counterattack, but Ward had predicted it. Every flanking unit, every reserve squad, was in position, and the alien soldiers intercepted the attackers with relentless efficiency. Keth watched the enemy crumble under pressure, and the human moved among the soldiers, placing devices, checking positions, and calling out adjustments as if conducting a battle like a master musician conducting a symphony. The battlefield was chaos controlled by order. The enemy could not anticipate the precision, and the alien soldiers executed every maneuver flawlessly. By sunset, the last enemy fortifications were under assault and the lines held steady. Ward moved forward, leading the charge into the central stronghold. Keth followed, seeing alien soldiers push with energy and courage that had been forged in the fires of previous battles. Every move was precise, every action calculated, every moment a lesson in strategy and courage. The human had turned a hopeless situation into a final push that seemed unstoppable, and Keth realized that the enemy would never again see humans as simple soldiers. They were forces of will and intellect and courage beyond measure. As darkness fell, the last tower fell into alien hands and the battlefield became silent, except for the echoes of victory. Ward walked among the soldiers, checking positions, adjusting lines and placing sensors and drones. The alien soldiers rested briefly, but their eyes reflected awe and respect, and a recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary, and that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, not just for strength but for intellect, willpower, and determination. As the first stars appeared in the sky, the soldiers gathered around their human leader, and for the first time Keth saw him allow a small smile. It was a recognition of what had been achieved, of the impossible becoming possible, and of one human shaping the destiny of an entire battlefield, and perhaps a species. The drop pod that had fallen from orbit had carried more than a soldier. It had carried hope, courage, and the reminder that even in the darkest hours, one being with determination could change the course of history. Keth stood among the soldiers and realized that this was the moment that would be remembered for centuries, that the war had been turned not by numbers, but by intellect and courage, that the alien soldiers had learned what humans were capable of, and that the story of the drop pod soldier would inspire every being who heard it. They had been losing the war until a single human had fallen from orbit, and in doing so had taught them that courage, strategy, and determination could never be defeated, and that the legacy of one determined being could shape the future of all humanity's triumph. The battlefield had fallen silent, and the fires of war flickered like dying stars across the horizon. Keith looked around at the alien soldiers who moved through the ruins, with a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and awe. They were no longer simply warriors. They were transformed beings who had learned what courage and strategy and determination could achieve. And in the center of it all stood Ward, the human, who had fallen from orbit and changed everything. His presence alone seemed to inspire order from chaos, hope from despair, and strength from weakness. He walked through the trenches, inspecting positions, checking drones, and observing the movements of soldiers as if he carried the battlefield in his mind, every calculation, anticipating every possibility. The enemy forces had been scattered and their command structures shattered, and for the first time in weeks there was a sense of calm. The alien soldiers no longer hesitated. They moved with purpose, communicating with gestures and signals they had learned from the human, following instincts sharpened by observation and action. Keth saw squads reinforcing weak points, rescuing the wounded, and securing weapons with precision, guided by the presence of the human who had become more than a soldier. He had become a symbol, a lesson, and a reminder that one individual with determination could turn the tide of history. Ward spoke to the alien commanders, sharing insights, strategies, and suggestions that were absorbed without question because every word carried the weight of experience. He walked among the soldiers, giving encouragement, adjusting plans, placing devices, and checking surveillance with a mind that never stopped calculating. Keth realized that the human had created a legacy not just in victory but in thought, in method, in courage, and in the belief that even the most hopeless situation could be overcome with intellect and willpower. As the sun rose on the horizon, casting gold across the battlefield, Ward gathered the alien soldiers and addressed them, not as a commander issuing orders but as a guide, sharing lessons learned from battle and from life. He spoke of courage that transcends species, of strategy that defies numbers, of resilience that conquers fear, and of the strength that comes from unity and determination. The soldiers listened in silence, feeling the magnitude of what they had witnessed, feeling the change within themselves, feeling the presence of a being who had redefined what it meant to fight and to lead. The ruins of the enemy stronghold stood as a testament to what had been lost and what had been gained, and Ward moved through them calmly, placing sensors and devices ensuring that the future would be secure, that victory would be maintained, and that the sacrifices made would not be in vain. Keth watched as alien soldiers worked side by side with humans, repairing defenses, coordinating patrols, and sharing knowledge. And he understood that this war had created something unprecedented, a connection, a respect, and a recognition of the power of humanity. By midday, the alien soldiers had established a perimeter, and Ward oversaw the coordination of patrols and supply lines. Keth noticed how the soldiers had changed how they moved with confidence and precision, how they communicated and acted with foresight and courage. He realized that the human had not only saved the day, but had rewritten the meaning of possibility, teaching them that intelligence, willpower, and courage could achieve the impossible, and that humanity was not to be underestimated in any form or measure. As the evening descended, Ward walked alone through the battlefield, and Keith followed, watching the humans scan the horizon, consider the strategies, and reflect on the lessons of the war. His presence was a reminder that the battle was never just about survival, but about growth, learning, and inspiring others to achieve beyond their limits. Every alien soldier who had fought under him had been transformed by his example and by his actions, and they would carry those lessons forward as they rebuilt their lines and prepared for the future. Stars appeared in the sky, and the battlefield was quiet except for the wind moving through broken walls and the faint murmur of soldiers preparing for the next day. Ward stood atop a mound overlooking the entire field, and for the first time he allowed himself a moment of reflection, a breath, a small smile, recognizing the courage, the strength, and the unity that had emerged from the chaos, and realizing that the drop pod that had fallen from orbit had carried more than a soldier. It had carried hope, willpower, and the undeniable proof that one human could change the course of history and inspire a legacy that would last for generations. Keth stood beside him, silently feeling the weight of what had happened, feeling the shift in perspective and understanding that humanity had proven itself not just as survivors, but as innovators, warriors, and leaders whose courage could inspire even the most unlikely allies. The battlefield had been lost by numbers, but won by intellect, courage, and determination, and the story of the drop pod human would be remembered forever, a tale told across species, a legend of hope and triumph, a reminder that even in the darkest hours one being could change everything, and that humanity would never be underestimated again. The fires of war faded and the horizon glowed with the promise of a new day. The soldiers rested and recovered, knowing that they had witnessed history and that they had been part of something extraordinary and unforgettable. Ward looked to the horizon, knowing that the legacy of this battle would live on in the minds and hearts of every soldier and every being who had been touched by his courage and determination, and that the story of the human who fell from orbit and changed the war would be told for generations as proof that humanity could achieve the impossible. And as the night settled across the battlefield and the stars shone above the ruined towers and the quiet trenches, one truth remained clear: that courage, intelligence, willpower, and determination could never be defeated, and that humanity had triumphed in a way no one could have imagined, and that the legend of the drop pod soldier would endure as a symbol of hope and the unstoppable spirit of one human standing against the impossible. The end.